Tonight on Greater Boston, a tale of two presidents and two questions looming over the next election cycle. First, is Joe Biden too old to run for re-election? If he wins, he'd be 86 at the end of his second term. The Atlantic's Mark Leibovich and the founder of the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, join me. Then, will Donald Trump hanging out with anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers like those he hosted for dinner the other night be a bridge too far for Republican voters? And how do his actions trickle down from Mar-A-Lago to the rest of America? Robert Trestan, Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League, he'll join me. When Joe Biden turned 80 earlier this month, he officially became the oldest sitting president in U.S. history. It's a milestone that's added new fuel to a long-running debate about whether he should run again in 2024, a move Biden has hinted at but not actually confirmed yet. And the angst amongst Democrats is palpable, as Mark Leibovich captured in The Atlantic, arguing the age issue will only get worse if Biden runs again. The whispers are becoming shouts. Mark is the author of the new book, Thank You for Your Servitude, and a staff writer for The Atlantic. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld is the founder and CEO of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute at Yale School of Management. Good to have you both, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to be here, Jim.
Mark, you wrote first line of your piece earlier this year. Let's put it bluntly, Joe Biden should not run for re-election. He is too old. Why?
80. I mean, you know, that was the number. Look, I don't want to be ageist here. Now I'll be ageist, I guess. I think you will talk people who study aging, people who study, doctors basically who are expert in this say that it is true that aging is different from person to person. Some people actually do fine at that age, but I think in most cases, it would be better suited to have someone younger in that job. And obviously, it's not for me to decide, but my sense is the Democrats, have been very risk averse in some ways in the age of Trump. I mean, Trump has made Republicans just terrified of him, but at the same time, Democrats have been extremely nervous about doing something, maybe a little different in the future, like sort of tapping someone who might have a different perspective. So I think that it's time for that. But again, I'm just one person.
Well, actually, you're two people. In the spirit of full disclosure, a spirit I rarely embrace, Jeffrey. I'm with Mark on this, but you write age is a dangerously misleading disqualifier. Can you explain that a little bit?
Both of you with your youthful minds are perfect examples how your experience doesn't get in the way of your freshness and your ability to think innovative thoughts. We take a look at across fields. Betty Friedan, the great, of course, feminist, told me at age 67, she said that she found the age mystique to be the most formidable bias, even more than the feminine mystique. And as you look at a lot of our leaders, as anybody watching the show think that they could outsmart the very savvy Nancy Pelosi at age 82, or regardless of how you feel about her politics or his politics, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell certainly has been awfully clever at each stage of his life, and he shows no sign of wilting. Benjamin Franklin wrote the Declaration of Independence at age 70, the Second World War, people like Charles de Gaulle and Averell Harriman, these people are all in their 80s. And
yeah,
frankly,
but Jeff, if I may interrupt you, you can obviously cherry pick, and I don't mean that as disparagingly as it sounds, 80 and 90-year-olds who do wonderfully well. But as Mark just said a minute ago, let me put this up for a minute. Here's a study out of the cognitive decline on cognitive decline in JAMA. And another study, the second number, the National Library of Medicine, when you're over 85 years old, which Joe Biden would be in the third year of his second term, 40% of people that age live with serious cognitive impairment. So you know what Joe Biden is like now. You have no idea what Joe Biden's going to be like in 5 years, right, Jeff?
Joe Biden had a stutter when he was 70, when he was 40, when he was 30.
I'm not talking about
when he
stutter.
was 9 years old, when he was 7 years old. Joe Biden would say goofy things and sometimes come up with with cringeworthy jokes at every stage in his life. It has nothing to do with age. As Mark and you said, and Mark said, I don't want to be ageist, and then went right off to be ageist.
Well,
if you don't want to be ageist, Mark, I can liberate you. Drop your chains. Stop being ageist. In fact, you said you can think of any demographic category and you can find average trends that will favor one group or another. Happily, we live in a society which is based on merit and individual assessment. We don't go for what color hair somebody has as to whether or not they fit a job.
Jeff, let me stop you there for a second. Let's go. You know, you cite geriatricians, Mark, in your piece in The Atlantic, who say exactly what Jeff is saying, which is it should be on a person-to-person basis. But you seem to be saying, obviously there can't be a formal age limit because the Constitution says, I think, 35, born here, I mean, naturalized citizen, born here, and I think you have to have lived here for at least 14 years. But informally, you basically think there should be an age limit, no?
I mean, I think it is a person-to-person thing, and I think that voters should decide. I mean, basically, age limits are a little bit, you know, they're dicey. I mean, there are age limits for air traffic controllers. There are age limits for drivers. There probably should be age limits for like a maximum age in which you can drive for. I think it varies from state to state. Sometimes you have to take a test or something like that. But look, I just I don't love age limits, but I do think that there is a certain self-awareness and self-knowledge and basically selflessness that someone who reaches a certain stage of his or her life, you know, should be mindful of when deciding, you know, whether the future of the country, whether the future of, you know, his immediate orbit is best served with him still in the chair.
You know, Jeff, you say, Mark says he doesn't like age limits. I know you really don't like age limits, but Mark cites in his piece, I think it's air traffic controllers 56 or something, pilots 65, and I assume both because if they can't perform adequately, they put me at risk. If a president can't perform adequately, he puts, or she puts everybody at risk. I don't understand why broad numbers about age groups don't matter to you as much as your judgment of an individual years before he reaches that age group.
Because there's no real science that supports this. That JAMA study is badly flawed. You'll be the first to hear this, and Mark will admit this on air. He didn't actually read the research in that study to see what instruments they used. If you look at the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Survey, which is what these studies rely upon, is it tells us the older we get, the dumber we get. Now, Mark, why is that? Jim, why is that? It's because it has a speed versus accuracy trade-off built into it. So a younger person makes fewer mistakes in the measures they used, makes more mistakes, but they're not penalized for that. An older person weights more. They use wisdom, and the error pattern in an older person in those same measurements is very low, but they just don't finish the damn test, and they are scored down for that because of the instrument's design. You go for these averages, and you miss everything. The reality is an individual assessment. That's what's lost here.
But if you may, but Jeff, I'm sorry, you're still not answering my question. Your assessment is the 80-year-old Joe Biden. Even if you reject, let me finish. Even if you reject what JAMA Neurology says, and I think it's a pretty respected journal, but even if you reject it for the moment, you have no idea what Joe Biden's going to be like as an 85 or 86-year-old man. I mean, that's obvious, is it not?
You know, we have a better idea of an older person's character than we do in how the CEO of FTX. I'm right here at an event with Sam Bankman-Fried, just footsteps away from me. To have a 20-something kid, we don't know what that person's going to do. And would you rather have that or Elizabeth Holmes?
Well, I don't think that's a fair choice. I don't think I want Bankman-Fried to be a president of the United States either.
Billions of dollars in these people. So if you took, and Mark comes up with, you talk about cherry picking, and Mark comes up with an example of air traffic controllers. Now, why would that be? Yes, it's because speed of reaction is lower. If manual dexterity matters, yeah, maybe on an assembly line, maybe an air traffic controller, where you have speed of response, that does make a difference.
Mark, do you want to respond to any of this?
Not really. I mean, I am cherry picking, but I actually think that this is a very narrow cognitive, area that is relevant. I mean, cherry picking is picking examples, to make your own argument.
Our elder statespersons.
Let him finish. Hey, Jeff, let him finish, and then you can say whatever you like. I'm sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
No, look, my only point is that as a consumer of politics, as someone who, is one of tens of millions of people who gets to pick a president. I would prefer someone younger, and I would hope and I would think that the Democrats would be better served to have a bunch of younger options.
If you felt differently, Mark, if when the 2024 approached or primaries approached, if you were to feel like I think most primary voters concluded several years ago that Joe Biden at 82 was the most likely Democrat to beat Donald Trump, would you swallow your principle and say he's the man?
Oh, yeah, it's not a principle. I think it's important that he win. I think it's important that Democrats win. I think, there's a very strong argument to be made that they are probably most likely to win with him, despite his age, though. And I do think that his age is a big despite. And look, I talked about risk aversion before. I mean, I think Joe Biden's single biggest contribution to this country and to, life, I think, it was beating Donald Trump in 2020. Mm-hmm. I think the Democratic voters, particularly in places like South Carolina, decided that he had a very practical chance, or the best practical chance of doing it. And it was a major contribution. He might be called upon to do it again if people believe that he is best suited for it. I would like to think that there are better candidates.
Jeff, in my eternal search for common ground, would a compromise position here be that there should be cognitive testing of candidates for higher office once they reach, pick any number you want, 60, 70, 75, 80, everybody, no discrimination, everybody of that age has to take a cognitive test and the results are made available to the voting public. How about that?
If you do it at every age, sure, but I wouldn't just start it at a certain senior's age.
Someone just went to the men's room behind you, by the way. But go ahead.
Yeah, by the way, the half a dozen times when I've interrupted you guys, only some of it is because of my obnoxiousness. Some of it really has had to do with just because they keep letting out a crowd at the event where I am right now. So
but you could live with cognitive testing, correct?
If you can look at Joe Biden's schedule, there's hardly anybody. And look at how he crisscrossed the nation just in the run-up to the elections, seeing President Xi Jinping, the G7, and all the rest, going to the heads of Canada, UK, Germany, right after. But who could do that at any age that's watching this show? You take a look at Konrad Adenauer at age 87. He brought the modern state of Germany back to life and brought it back into the world community. And at age 90, he was still running the Christian Democratic Union, the presiding power. Nobody talked about his age. Look it up. Look at any newspaper. People celebrated him. They were sorry when he stepped down. This age was not a relevant issue until now. We have baby boomers that are, raising becoming a question of being attacked by other age segments. We shouldn't fall into this ageism. There's really no justification for it. If there's anything we should retire, we should retire the bias around age.
Jeff Sonnenfeld,
No,
Mark Leibovich.
So.
Oh, you have a final thought, Mark? I'm sorry.
No, I don't think we should retire the bias around age, because age is just a number.
On that note, Mark Leibovich, Jeff Sonnenfeld, great to see you both, gentlemen. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
From the moment he announced his 2016 run for president, birther-in-chief Donald Trump has not been shy about showing us who he truly is, calling most Mexican migrants rapists and drug dealers at the beginning of his campaign, referring to white supremacists as very fine people. And now into his 2024 run, Trump appears to be diving in even deeper, if that's even possible. Just last week, he hosted a dinner at the Mar-A-Lago compound, and among those at his table, fellow 2024 candidate and musical artist Kanye West, who's been very outspoken with his anti-Semitic views these days. Also with him, white nationalist, Holocaust denier, fan of Putin and Hitler, Nick Fuentes. In response, after several days of silence on the subject, House Speaker-to-be Kevin McCarthy said publicly on Tuesday, Fuentes' ideology has no place in society, though he mistakenly asserted Trump condemned it as well. Then Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell followed up with a slightly stronger, there is no room in the Republican Party for anti-Semitism or white supremacy, but as usual, both stopped short of condemning Trump himself. And even as former Vice President Mike Pence said Trump should apologize, he added he didn't believe Trump was an anti-Semite. No, he just hosts dinners for them. I'm joined by Robert Trestan, Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League. Robert, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask this first question, but I gotta. What was your reaction when you first heard about this dinner?
I couldn't believe it. It was really shocking because regardless of what you, whether you agree or you voted for President Trump, he still carries the word president before his name. That's part of our history. And for him to be breaking bread with anti-Semites and a white, who are, pushing forward an anti-Semitic agenda and white supremacy, it's just shocking. That is not what I expect. Forget about that I'm Jewish and anti-Semitism is important to me. It's not what I expect as an American of a former American president.
You don't expect it from this former American president?
No. It's below any sort of standard.
You know, you've been following and trying to eradicate hate for your whole career. Forget what you just said, or put it aside for the moment, the whole notion of what it looks like to have a former president hosting this kind of abomination. What's the trickle-down impact? Is it mainstream hate for people who are open to it? What's the impact on those kind of people?
Well, it's a consistent strategy that we've actually seen over the last several years.
Meaning what?
It empowers, it incites, and it inspires people to commit acts of violence, acts of hate. And, President Trump may not intend that. It's possible that Ye doesn't either, and neither does Fuentes. But there is an impact, there's an outcome of their language, their behavior, and this coming together.
With all due respect, how can you say that he may not intend this? I mentioned birtherism. We know that African countries are shithole countries. We know that some Congress people of color should go back to the countries they came from. I mean, it's hard for almost anybody to say a former president's a racist. His behavior is that of a racist relentlessly, is it not?
Well, his actions are certainly questionable, but the main concern, to your question about what's the impact across the country, is that it inspires people. Look at some of the mass violence that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So what happened in Colorado, keep in mind that the white supremacists who may be targeting Jews, who are targeting people of color, they hate people within the LGBTQ community just as much. Mm-hmm. They're not discriminating. And so, there is a real life impact when people are inspired. And when they see this kind of gathering, the former president hosting people who have these views, it does give it credibility.
Almost every time I'm in a conversation with someone about the appalling behavior of Donald Trump, I step back and I say, what's even more upsetting to me than Trump's unconscionable behavior is that whole list I gave you a minute ago about things that Trump had done and said, and I could go on for an hour like this. People knew that when 74 million of them voted for him after he'd served for 4 years. What does it say that 74 million people, I would assume most of whom know at least one or two of these situations, seem willing to tolerate that in the leader of the free world?
It's pretty scary. But it also it's also a sign that we need more people to be standing up. So we see some people within the Republican Party starting to say something about this dinner. But the issue is not that it's not consistent, the ideology is not consistent with the Republican Party. It really is, it's not consistent with American politics. It's not consistent with governance in this country. We don't want to have extremists making policy for us.
So would it make a difference? I mean, Judy Woodruff at PBS sent her reporters out to talk to 57 Republicans the other day to get their reaction to this. Most of them didn't respond. Of those who responded, if I remember correctly, only Senator Cassidy from Louisiana and Mitt Romney, who's no big fan of Trump's to begin with, had the courage to say the name Trump in their criticism of this. If the GOP as a whole had the courage, and most of them do not, to stand up to this guy and his racism and his anti-Semitism, would that not have a beneficial effect on the thing you're concerned about, this people waiting for hate to be permissible and mainstreamed and that sort of thing? Wouldn't it help?
The key word is courage. And, when we watch some of the, if you think about what happened in Colorado, there were people who stood up in that just horrific moment. They exhibited courage. And if more people exhibited that courage, we might start to see a change here.
You know, speaking of change, one of the things that I fear that I fall into is I say to myself when I think about the worst of Trumpism, well, when Trump is gone, he either loses badly in this primary here, or he decides he doesn't want to run, or he loses to a Democrat in 2024. It ends with him, which I realize is incredibly naive. Yeah. This has been so embedded in America, in great part because of Trump. I'm not saying that's the sole reason. How do you, what's the antidote? I mean,
it's been mainstreamed. I mean, this is, what we see today has been building for years and years. This didn't just sort of happen.
Yeah, but it was elevated to an art form during Donald Trump and even post-presidency. He's there. So what is the fix for this, with or without Trump on the scene? What's the realistic fix?
I think it's a full court press on that we need to really we need to redefine who we are. And I think part of that comes within the American political structure. We don't want to have extremists within the military, within law enforcement. We have a perfect example of that here in Massachusetts, where a police officer was part of Charlottesville, which Nick Fuentes, by the way, was one of the people who was present.
There was a police officer from Boston, it was a January 6th, who his situation has still not been resolved almost 2 years later, by the way.
And then it goes all the way up to our leaders. And that's whether you're on the school committee, whether you're, a member of a city council, or whether you're in Congress or in the White House.
So, and how do world leaders view a former leader who has an event like he had the other night at his palatial landing in Florida? Well,
we saw many examples of President Trump's interaction with world leaders, during his tenure as president. I think this may be a defining moment in the campaign in the next 0 to 24 months.
Did you say that same thing when he got off the bus and was talking about women's genitals, or when he talked about McCain or Khizr Khan, or didn't you say those same things then? He seems to be pretty immune.
The country's in a different place now than it was then, and we've also experienced many other different things. So I'm not sure it's a fair. I'm not sure it's a fair comparison, because things are changing dramatically all the time, and we need to be monitoring those changes and reacting accordingly.
One more thing before you go, Robert. Talk about courage. I meant to mention this before, but I forgot. A lot of conservative Jewish groups have chosen for maybe 6 years now to ignore the worst of Trump as long as he was steadfast in his support of Israel. That wall seems to be breaking a little bit since Mar-a-Lago. Am I being overly optimistic?
After this dinner, I think you saw across the spectrum, including many Republican Jews who have been supportive of him, were highly critical of him, and many organizations. I think there was an across-the-board recognition that this crossed the line, but it didn't just cross the line. Is dangerous.
And do you think the American people have had enough of this kind of behavior? And I'm not talking, I mentioned the 74 million who voted for it, but as a whole, on my rare optimistic moments, I seem to think that even they have had enough, not just of this, but of crap from people like Lauren Boebert talking about drag queens not coming to her district, and then, of course, professing great sympathy for the 5 people murdered at Club Q. Are we finally saying we've had enough of this?
I think Americans are sick and tired of the hate violence and people losing their lives because of who they are. And it's directly connected. And so whatever it takes, we need to come together as a country and define who we want to be, because this is not who we are as Americans. And we need to change that.
I hope you're right, Robert. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. Appreciate it a lot, Robert Trestan. That's it for tonight. Thank you for watching. And please don't forget Ukraine.
What is the difference between a rotary and a roundabout? What is a cruller? Is it true that casinos pump oxygen through the air? We have received a lot of questions from you in recent weeks, and we're going to answer some of them right now. Ryan Neufeld from Milford asks, what is the difference between a rotary and a roundabout? Well, Ryan, it's a difference of size and speed. Rotaries tend to be larger, you're allowed to drive more quickly around them, and they usually have more than one lane. Alternatively, roundabouts are smaller, you must drive around them slower, and they are single lane. Now, there's more than 100 rotaries here in Massachusetts, but that is changing. State and municipalities are trying to convert as many of those rotaries as they can to roundabouts because, not surprisingly, roundabouts are safer. An anonymous curiosity seeker from Lowell asks, is it true that casinos pump oxygen through the air? And if it's not true, where did the rumor come from? Well, it is indeed an urban myth. And for clarity, we reached out to our local casino, Encore, and they responded with a statement. Here's what they had to say. It is believed that this urban legend comes from Mario Puzo's novel Fools Die, where a casino owner who owns a fictitious hotel in Las Vegas pumped oxygen into the casino in order to keep gamblers awake and spending for longer. This is absolutely not true of real-life casinos. In fact, as an accelerant, it would be highly dangerous to pump oxygen into any space, as it could cause a fire to spread rapidly, since the flammability of the air would be increased. Elizabeth Warrior from Cambridge, Massachusetts asks, do people who have beards retain more germs on their faces than people who do not? Well, Elizabeth, studies on this very topic have been published in places like European Radiology and the Journal of Hospital Infections. And the conclusion is that, yes, people who have beards retain germs on their faces, but so do people who don't have beards. And in fact, the amount of germs, about the same. Question from John Tobin in Charlestown, a.k.a. our producer's dad. What is a cruller? What is its history? And why is it disappearing? Well, John, when we talk about the cruller, we have to make a distinction. There is the French cruller, and then there is the German/Dutch cruller. Now, some sources will tell you that the cruller was introduced here in America by the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are in fact German. Other sources say that the actual Dutch brought the cruller here to America, which would make sense since that word cruller is from a Dutch word, which means curl. Either way, they soared in popularity in the 1800s in and around Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and of course remain popular today. Now, the big difference between these crullers is the dough. So the German-Dutch version is a little bit more like a traditional donut dough, and their shape is kind of longer and less twisty. The French version is round and is made of a choux pastry. As for your question about why they are disappearing, I have it on good authority that if they are disappearing around you, it is probably because you are eating them all. In fact, we see no evidence whatsoever that they are disappearing. An influential chef from Du's Donuts in Brooklyn, named Chef Wiley Dufresne, just a few years ago said that crullers were having a moment. And on a personal note, I was able to, with no problems whatsoever, get my hands on a French cruller at my local Dunkin' Donuts this morning. And now I am going to have a personal moment with my cruller.
The Curiosity Desk is sponsored by Emerson College, inspiring curiosity and creative expression in all of us.